Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be taking a look at 1b4, also known as the Polish opening, also known as Sokolski's opening. I did a video on this when I first started my YouTube channel. I did it in front of a display board, and over the years people have asked me to redo the video. This video is not just me redoing the video, it's also me updating the video, giving the most modern theory, and giving you one video where you're going to have a complete repertoire on how to play 1b4 with white and how to defend against 1b4 with black. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So when you play 1b4, the idea is basically to move this pawn up and put your bishop on the long diagonal and basically declare that you have some sort of slight edge. It's very similar to the Larson's opening, which does the exact same thing, but is a little bit more conservative. It just moves the pawn up one square. That's a little bit less weakening, and it's a little bit safer. Sokolski's opening gains a little bit more space, also creates a few more weaknesses. Now, when you play 1b4, they can respond with a lot of different things. They can respond with 1e5 in this position. They can respond with 1d5 in this position. They can respond with c6. They can respond with a5. Now, a5 is, believe it or not, the move that I like to play. And I know this looks goofy to open up a game with 1b4, 1a5, but we'll get to sort of why you might want to do something like this in a second, because there are actually reasons to want to open up with 1a5, and this is actually my recommendation for how to face the Sokolskis, is to play 1a5. But the first thing that we need to know how to do if we're going to play Sokolski's with white is we need to know what to do if somebody tries to refute Sokolski's opening, which people will try to do. They can try to refute it with this move c6. That's what c6 is really aimed at. It's really an attempt at a refutation of 1b4. Basically just trying to take advantage of the fact that this pawn is a little overextended and maybe it's a weakness. So after 1c6, we're going to have bishop to b2, and then we're going to have one of two attempts to refute this. We're going to have either queen b6 or we're going to have pawn to a5. Now, of these two, a5 is maybe a little bit more sophisticated. The move queen b6 is very, very direct. It's just attacking the pawn on b4. And you can actually just defend it. You can play a3 and just defend that pawn. And then typically here they go after that pawn again. They go after it with a5. Now, on the surface, it looks like you don't really have a good move here. It looks like you either have to block up your bishop with a move like pawn to c3, or you're going to end up losing the pawn. Like if you play bishop c3, they can of course play a b. They can exchange the rook on a1, and when the bishop captures, that pawn on b4 is hanging. You know, a lot of arrows, but still, that's the main problem. But you do actually have a resource here, and it's a pretty cool resource, and it's been known for a really long time. You have this resource pawn to c4. And the idea behind pawn to c4 is that when they play a captures b4, you have this move pawn to c5, which attacks the queen. Now, at this point, the queen has no better move than to move backwards. It needs to move back to like d8, c7, just backwards. And then a takes b4, rook takes a1, bishop takes a1 should just be very, very slight edge white. White has a little bit more space. Now, you might be wondering, why can't black just take this pawn? If queen takes c5, this is a known trap. A takes b4, attacks the queen and attacks the rook. This is a double attack. If queen takes b4, we take the rook. If they take the bishop, we take the knight. And of course, now white has a totally decisive advantage. So that brings us back to queen b6. If you're going to try to refute the Polish, you don't actually have to be this direct. You can play a move like a5. Now, if you play a5, if white responds with the similar idea to this move pawn to a5, like if white plays a3, which is actually a question mark move, then all of the ideas actually work here a little bit better for black. Black can play a b4, and then exchange on a1, and then play queen b6. And now this completely works. Black has basically refuted white's setup. White either has to play the move pawn to c3 and block his bishop, in which case black can just follow up with e5 or even d5 and just have an advantage in the middle of the board and just kind of laugh at the bishop on a1. Or white can play a move like bishop c3, but then after knight a6, that pawn is attacked twice and only defended once, and there's no way to defend it a second time. So now white is going to lose a whole pawn, and it's going to be a clean pawn. But of course, that's not the whole story. If we could just refute the Polish, this would be a fairly quick video. The video would be over right now. White shouldn't defend the pawn with pawn to a3, and it seems anti-instinctual. I mean, what else are you going to do? Taking on a5 doesn't seem right. The b pawn is probably worth a little bit more than the a pawn. The correct move is to just play b5. You can play b5 and offer this pawn up as a sacrifice, and even the engine backs this up. Even modern engines back up this move. And there just isn't a whole lot black can do after you've made this move. You're threatening to support this pawn with a move like e3 at some point, in which case the pawn is completely safe. So the only move you really have to worry about for preparation purposes is if they take it. And if they take it, you can reply with e4. e3 is also possible, but e4 is fine. You're attacking this pawn, and really, they can either defend it or move it. Now, if they move it, you can actually play the move pawn to a3. And this position is, somewhere between equality and maybe slight edge white. Probably slight edge white, to be completely honest. After b takes a3 and, say, knight takes a3, you've got a ton of development for the one pawn that you're down. And black has a lot of weaknesses that he can't fix. Now, what is decidedly worse for black is if he tries to hold it with queen b6, because now you're taking advantage of the weaknesses with tempo. You're going to be playing knight to c3, and then, say, b4, and then you're going to be playing knight to d5. Now, already there's issues here. Black should just play queen d6, I guess is the best move. But no matter what he does, he's going to be in trouble. He does have to worry about giving you additional tempos. If he plays a move like queen c6, for example, you would have the move bishop to b5. And just to show you kind of the idea, if queen c6, we would have bishop b5, and they can't take the queen because knight c7 check is going to fork the king and queen and win the game. So white's just gaining a free additional tempo for absolutely no reason by moving the queen to c6. Hence, queen d6, but then knight f3 is still gaining a free additional tempo, and there's not a whole lot black can do about it. After knight f3, black can either play something like f6, in which case apparently c4, followed by knight c3 with the idea of bringing that knight to b5, knight a6, bishop e2, e6, e5, queen b8, and then rook c1, bishop e7, knight b5 is decisive advantage white, according to the engine, in spite of white still being down a pawn. And the other way that black can play this is he can try to play a move like knight c6, developing a piece, and then apparently after d4, the engine already says this is decisive advantage white, but a sample line would go something like e6, knight b6, rook b8, d5, knight back to d8, knight to c4, queen c7, and then d captures e6, and there just is not a good recapture here. For example, if d captures e5, bishop e5 is just devastating in this position. We're, of course, winning everything. The queen and the rook are lined up, and you can see all black's pieces are still in the back rank. So this is an absolutely nightmarish scenario for black. So needless to say, you shouldn't be too worried if somebody tries to refute your setup beginning with c6. You should have at least an equal to slightly better position for white if they try to do this, if you play the best lines. So that leaves the other lines that we have to worry about. That leaves the e5s and the d5s, etc. So this is something that pretty much every strong player has been aware of over the years. They know that these other ideas are more playable. So let's start with sort of the main move here, this move pawn to e5. Well, against pawn to e5, we're going to play bishop to b2. And now there's a couple of different choices. One of them loses sort of right away. You could try to defend your pawn with, say, knight c6. It's important to know this trap. Against knight c6, you can play b5, and this wins a pawn by force. b5, knight d4, e3 protects the pawn on b5, and then after the knight moves, we simply capture that pawn, and white is up a pawn and should have some sort of major advantage. So the alternative is to either take the pawn on b4 or defend the pawn with a move like pawn to d6. So if black were to defend this pawn with a move like pawn to d6, we'd start getting into these King's Indian type positions. Now what's interesting about these King's Indian type positions is if we play these King's Indian type positions, we would actually rather have this pawn already have advanced to b5. So if you want to choose the setup where you're playing e5 and d6, we have to go kind of all the way back to the beginning where you're playing the black pieces. And remember I said I was going to come back to this. And after b4, we should probably start this setup with a5. The point being that white really needs to play b5 at this juncture. And then we play e5, and then bishop b2, and then d6. And of course, the big difference here is now we've etched out that c5 square for our knight. And that is a big deal because it prevents white from striking in the middle with a move like pawn to e4 and going after the whole center sort of with impunity. In this case, if white goes after the center with pawn to e4, it's basically a strategic error. black can play knight f6, and then black can follow up with knight d7, and even plant his knight on c5 right away, putting pressure on the e4 square and making white's position very awkward. After a move like d3, black can continue with his King's Indian setup with g6. The computer is always already giving this somewhere between equality, maybe as much as slight edge black. So black is doing very good here. Now, that being said, this isn't a line that you have to be totally worried about if you're playing white. You can, of course, choose to play e3 instead of e4, and you still have firm control over the d4 square. So, for example, knight d7, knight f3 should still be slight edge white. If the knight goes to c5, you're going to kick it away with pawn to d4, and white should just have a slight advantage in this position. There's nothing wrong with this. So this is slight edge white, but of course this is a good way for black to play chess as well, which is one of the reasons that I recommend a5 against b4. I think it's a totally reasonable move. So anyways, going back to b4 and then e5, we have bishop to b2, and then another possibility to defend that pawn is pawn to f6. Now this goes all the way back to a couple different games. I got a game that goes all the way back to Tartakower versus Reddy. And I guess another player that was inspired by that game was Fischer versus Glogger, who had to play this in 1964. And the Fischer game is the one that I usually follow because Fischer played it a little bit better. But his idea was to play e4, and then after bishop takes b4, they both played bishop to c4, knight e7. And now Fischer played the move queen h5, which I think is a little bit better. And then in Tartakower versus Reddy, continue with pawn to f4. But the idea is essentially the same. They both want to play like a Evans Gambit / King's Gambit hybrid, where they get both bishops on the long diagonals, and life is good. Now, I think Fischer played queen h5 essentially to prevent the move pawn to d5 from black. So I think Fischer viewed this as an improvement over the Tartakower versus Reddy game, where f4 was met with the immediate d5. So after queen h5 in Fischer's game, we had knight g6, and then we had f4, so essentially the same idea. Then we had e takes f4, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, bishop c3, bishop c3, d6, knight to h4, piling that pressure on the g6 square, knight on c to e7, knight f5, king f8, castles kingside, and of course Fischer has a huge attack for the material, and he's got tons of pieces on really nice squares. This is just altogether a really beautiful position, and already very difficult to defend. We have queen e8, and then the tactical blow, bishop takes f6. Of course, the point being you can't play gf6 because queen h6 is mate. So here we have bishop takes f5, e takes f5, pawn to d5, f takes g6, g takes f6, queen h6 check, king to g8, g7, trapping the rook on h8, and black resigns. So that's a very pretty game to follow, and it's a game that you probably should follow. This is probably a good way to play against the f6 line if you are playing the white pieces. e4 is still a very legitimate response to this. Now, the modern main line that people have tried against the Polish is basically just to take this pawn. They've played bishop takes b4, and then after bishop takes e5, they've played knight f6. Now, in my previous video, I said that, white should just try something like pawn to c4, and that's what a lot of players have tried in the past, because the line that people have been worried about is if you continue with something like knight to f3 and say castles e3, d5, bishop e2, c5, you can't play d4 yet because your pawn is pinned. And then after you castle and they play knight c6, your bishop has this very unwelcome choice of going either back to b2 or to g3. And in both cases, black is going to play d4. Now, out of the two choices, b2 is a worse option. If you go to b2, you're going to have pawn to d4, and black has essentially cut the board in half. I had this position in reverse against Miles Ardeman years ago, and I ended up winning. In this case, he was playing the Polish with black, but it was essentially the same thing. And black has a huge advantage here because he's just going to play bishop a5 to c7 and then bishop g4 and whip up a big attack against the white king. And white doesn't have enough pieces to defend the king side. He can't get his pieces over there to defend, so eventually black should be winning in this position, or at the very least, black has a slight edge here. Probably not winning, but somewhere between slight edge to major advantage, black already. White can't activate his center, and black has more space on the king side where he's going to be attacking. There's a lot of isolated queen pawn positions that are essentially like this as well. So even if you don't retreat to b2, even if you play bishop g3, d4 is still annoying. It's, black has more space. It's an isolated queen pawn position, whereas he's managed to get the pawn advanced, and he should have at least equality here. So that was very frustrating, and it was very unclear exactly how to deal with this. So the thinking goes that, okay, well, what if I just play c4 right away? Everything should be fine. The thought had not really occurred to me to play the move that got played, and it actually annoys me a little bit. But the guy that played it is, of course, somebody that you can't help but respect. The guy that played it was Magnus Carlsen, and he played this move in 2022. So this is one of the updated games that I really have to mention. He played this move in 2022, and of course, it was also played by Nakamura. I got a game from Nakamura who played this as well back in 2021. So they were both doing this, and c3 is a really cool move, and it's something that should have occurred to me. I mean, White can basically play this position no matter what, as long as he can get his pawn to d4 before Black has had time to play d5, c5, and d4. So c3 should have been a fairly obvious move, but for whatever reason it wasn't. So c3, for example, bishop a5, and then they were both playing g3. I mean, it's also possible to play other things, like maybe you could play e3, etc. But they were trying to take this Catalan approach, this Catalan setup, and they were responding to Castles was the Carlsen game, and then of course we had Nakamura versus Fiddler continue with c6, bishop to g2, Castles e3, rook e8, bishop f6, queen f6, knight e2, d5 castles, knight d7, d4. And of course, the point in both games is they're just getting this Catalan set up. They're getting a preponderance of pawns in the middle. Eventually, they can play a move like c4, cd, d4, etc. And White should have some sort of slight edge here. And in both cases, White ended up winning. In both the Magnus Carlsen game, which continued instead of the move pawn to c6, continued castles. And then Magnus Carlsen replied bishop f6, queen f6, bishop g2, rook d8, e3, d5, knight e2, c6, castles, bishop f5, d4. As you can see, very similar. Still going for the same center, going for the same long diagonal, going for the same ideas with c4. They both ended up winning. Now, in the Magnus Carlsen game, Magnus Carlsen ended up not playing c4, which makes it different than the Nakamura versus Fiddler game, where Nakamura did end up playing c4. In the Carlsen game, he ended up switching gears, knight d7, knight d2, bishop to d3, rook c1, bishop a6, rook e1, rook e8, knight f4, and now his idea is to play e4. And then after queen d8, we had e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, and apparently after knight to d3, bishop c4, queen d2, knight f6, queen f6, knight to c5. Apparently White's doing really good here, and White ended up going on to win. That was Carlsen versus Blue Bomb played on chess.com back in 2022. So both of these approaches are fine, but essentially the correct move is to play this move pawn to c3 with the idea of playing d4. And apparently this idea with fianchettoing and going into these Catalan setups, even if you just end up exchanging your bishop on f6, is perfectly acceptable, which makes a ton of sense. If you get rid of your dark squared bishop and then plant all of your pawns on dark squares, it should be totally fine that you just gave up your dark squared bishop. So that kind of leaves us with our last setup, which you play b4 and they play d5. And there's a couple different ways that they can play d5. They can play d5 with the idea of, like, say, after bishop to b2, they play queen d6, and they just go after the whole center with pawn to e5. And that, on the surface, that at least looks a little scary. And another way that they can play d5 is they can play it sort of in the more passive way. And the other way that this happens is you can go at this from a slightly different move order. You can play knight f3, d5, b4, for example. And this was actually a pretty cool game. This was Alekhine versus Druitt that was played back in 1923. So Alexander Alekhine actually played a Polish by transposition with the white pieces. And that game continued e6, bishop b2, and of course you don't have bishop b4 because g7 hangs. And then you have knight f6, a3, and then you had c5, dc5, bishop c5, e3, castles, c4. So Alekhine's going after the center with pawn to c4, and etc. This is kind of the normal plan when you have the 3-on-2. You have 3 pawns versus 2 in the middle of the board. You're going to play c4, and you're going to go after the center of the board by attacking it this way with the secondary break. So here we have knight to c6, we have d4, bishop b6, knight on b to d2, queen e7, bishop d3, rook to d8, castles, bishop d7, knight e5, bishop e8, pawn to f4. So Alekhine's taking what's sort of known as the Pillsbury setup, or something very similar to the Pillsbury setup. And he's actually setting up a really scary tactical shot down the road that's a little difficult to see unless you've seen the idea before. And Black completely missed it. After rook a to c8, we had rook c1, and then we had knight d7, which is just an absolute question mark move. It walks face first into the tactical idea. That tactical idea began with the move knight takes c6, and then rook takes c6, and then the immediate c5 is major advantage white. Actually, it's decisive advantage white already. The point is black doesn't have anything better than to sacrifice for that pawn, because he's running out of oxygen for his rook, he's running out of space for his pieces. So he ended up playing knight c5 takes and then takes, but now both bishops are open, and this allows a double bishop sacrifice. Alekhine starts it with the move rook to f3 because he wanted his rook to get into the game, and then after bishop takes a3, he played the move rook takes c6 first. Now, at this point, he should have just sacrificed both bishops. He could have just played it right away. Bishop takes h7 is confirmed by the engine to be completely winning. But he instead played rook takes c6 first. He was lucky. His opponent could have tried to make things complicated with bishop b2, although he still would have had a major advantage after rook c2, so Alekhine would have been okay. But after the move bishop c6, his opponent, Druitt, just walked completely face first into the move bishop takes h7, which essentially ended the game. Bishop h7, king h7, rook h3, king g8, and then the point was the second bishop sacrifice, bishop g7, because if you take that bishop, you're getting mated. If king takes bishop, you have queen g4, king f6, queen g5 is mate, or king f8 and rook h8 is mate. So he had to play f6, but then unfortunately the position is just completely lost. Alekhine just brought his pieces into the game. He made a few exchanges, retreated his bishop, and he's up a whole bishop. So that was decisive advantage white. That was Alekhine versus Druitt. But of course, there's other ideas behind, this d5 idea. We can, of course, play d5 with the idea of taking the whole center, especially if we go from the main Polish move order, which begins with b4 and then d5. There's no reason that after bishop b2, we have to transpose into something passive. We don't have to play knight f6 followed by e6, for example. That's not necessary. We can be aggressive, and we can take the whole center with black. We can play queen d6, a3, e5. Now, as it turns out, this isn't something that white should be worried about. As a matter of fact, white should probably have a slight edge in this position no matter what. The point is that the queen being awkward on d6 is more important than the center being occupied by black. Because, of course, white can fight back in the middle. He can play e3 and c4. And that's what he should do. He should play e3. And then actually on almost any black move, white should play c4, as it turns out. If you look at this on the engine, you should play c4 on almost any black move. Even black moves that put pressure on the center of the board, like even against a5, c4 is apparently the correct idea. Of course, the point being that, again, we have this idea of a takes b4, and then we have this tactic involving c5, which is similar to the trap that we saw earlier. The real difficulty that black has is he's really tied down to this pawn. If this queen ends up having to move, he's going to hang this pawn on e5. And that's going to be very frustrating for him. So you can actually respond to any number of moves with the move pawn to c4, and it should be slight edge white. Even moves that seemingly just prevent it. Bishop e6, c4 is still apparently the best move. And then, for example, if d takes c4, just trying to take that pawn, we can play queen c2 going after that pawn, and we'll just say b5 to defend the pawn. Now we can play knight f3 going after the pawn on e5, knight d7, d3, so we are actually sacrificing. Takes, bishop takes, but we have a ton of activity for this sacrifice. We're threatening the pawn on b5, threatening bishop e4, and we've got that pressure on the e5 square that black has to worry about. So the main problem black has to solve is the pawn on b5. a6 is sort of forced. We're going to have castles, knight on g to f6, rook d1, putting pressure on the queen, and unfortunately after the queen moves, the pawn on e5 is hanging. So like queen b6, knight takes e5, and this is actually decisive advantage white according to the engine. So at least according to the engine, if your opponent plays d5, bishop b2, queen d6, a3, e5, and goes after the whole center, you're supposed to have a slight advantage in all cases. So even after e3, bishop e6, and then say c4, even if they just defend their center with a move like c6, you should still have some sort of slight advantage here. A sample line would be cd5, cd5, knight f3, knight d7, knight c3, a6, knight a4, knight on g to f6, and then of course knight c5 is possible, again because that queen is super awkward on d6, and it's very easy to loosen up the defense of the e5 square. And as soon as the defense of that e5 square goes away, white's going to have an advantage. Even if we just push the pawn, that's going to give us a square. We're going to play knight e6 takes and then knight d4, and that position should be slight edge white. So anyways, that pretty much covers everything that you might have to face if you're playing the Polish opening as white, and that also sort of covers my recommendations for how to play against the Polish if you happen to be playing against it with black. You can, of course, play whatever you want. You can play the e5 line. That's what a lot of grandmasters were playing for the longest time. But of course, you got to deal with the brand new Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura theory, where they play sort of a Catalan setup. My recommendation is almost just to go with this move pawn to a5 and sort of just play that King's Indian setup, where you've at least forced them to give you this concession of having to play the pawn on b4 to b5, and then you go ahead and go e5 and you go d6, and you start positioning your pieces on good squares, and at the very least, you're taking away their option of playing pawn to e4. Anyways, I hope you liked this. I hope this was a good video. I hope you learned everything that you needed to know about the Polish. I hope you can now play it with confidence or defend against it with confidence. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.